Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to the Everyday Missionary Podcast. And this is episode 157. Yes, 157. We are inching our way up there week after week because, frankly, that's kind of the Christian life anyway. Everything is about inching our way little by little, day by day. And then over the course of a lifetime, hopefully we've grown, right? That's the whole kind of idea behind the Christian life. And what I find is that most of our growth is almost invisible to kind of the naked eye, if you will. Like, in other words, we don't tend to grow by these giant leaps. I mean, I think it happens occasionally in life where we read a really life-changing book, or maybe we go to a conference, or there's some event that kind of leaps our faith to a new level, or we get some kind of revolutionary perspective on life that we just never saw before, and there's this giant jump in faith or understanding or appreciation or whatever it is. Like, I do think that happens, but if you counted those up over a lifetime, it's probably not a ton of things, but it's those daily little things, those habits we form and we keep doing, or those little alterations, those tiny little aha moments. Those are the ones that really make a difference. And so this is why we call this the Everyday Missionary, because every day should be a focus on our development and growth, where it's more about learning to be like Jesus and to think like Jesus and to think less like us. And I think part of that process is having to acknowledge the kind of culture any Christian is in. I think in that culture, realizing the hidden dangers that are there that conspire against our growth, and then trying to consciously live life counter to those influences. And so today I want to talk about something that I think is sort of under the surface. It's like a hidden problem that we will wrestle with as Christians, that unless we kind of call it out and identify it, we're not going to easily see it. And if we don't see it, we're not going to grow through it. All right. And the theme of this, I guess, relates to the word suffering. All right. Which I know already you're like, I think I'm going to click stop on this. I don't want to hear anything about suffering. Well, it's not exactly about suffering. I'm going to take that word and I'm going to then take us to where I think our challenge is. And then I'm going to see what we do with this. But throughout the Bible, and I think in the New Testament, I think the word comes up, like suffer comes up almost 100 times, right? And then there's suffering and all kinds of other little derivatives of it. It's a pretty major word. And I think it comes back to the fact that when we study the life of Jesus, we read through the Gospels, he's really trying to prepare us for the fact that the more committed we are to him in this life, the more this life will sort of revolt against that, against him and against us. And so we shouldn't be surprised by suffering or opposition or persecution or any kind of just basic resistance, because he's told us from the get-go, like, don't follow me if you don't want resistance, because that's just sort of part of the secret sauce in this world. And so that's why he says it's really the world to come that you really get the dividends and benefits of. If you're trying to just hold on to everything in this life, you're going to kind of lose it, he says. But if you let go of the stuff of this life, then you gain. So not a new theme to this podcast, but what I've been thinking about as it relates to suffering and kind of our aversion to it is not so much just simply that we don't want to suffer, but I've been noticing lately how we don't even like to be inconvenienced, all right? So this is why in some ways the podcast today is not about suffering, it's about inconvenience and how we don't even do well with that necessarily. And I've been watching it, just generically speaking, when I think about evangelical Christianity. I've been watching it now for months, where as we continue to be inconvenienced in our faith, where we can't do church like we used to do church, maybe we don't have the same level of engagement or ministry or relationship, we don't get the same music experience or worship experience or children's ministry experience, or we don't have the same kind of continuity of hugs and donuts and coffee and small groups, and the list goes on and on. What we ultimately have experienced in our Christian rhythms is inconvenience, all right? But we're almost treating the inconvenience like suffering, and then almost in that going like, how unbearable is this inconvenience? And this is what I want to sort of talk about briefly today to get us to snap out of it, because I think at the core, what it really reminds me of is a type of Goldilocks Christianity that says, you know what, I don't want it too hot, I don't want it too cold, I don't want it too inconvenient, I don't want it too much suffering, I want it just right. And if it's not just the way I want it, then there's a problem. And I'm allowed to be bothered or frustrated or whatever else. And this is where I think it comes back to this the message of the New Testament, learning to suffer well, learning to be inconvenienced well, learning that when you don't get your Goldilocks faith, how to navigate that well, how to still be grateful and thankful and joyful and giving and kind of personally sacrificial and not grumbling and arguing and complaining, but rather going, yeah, like, this is exactly where Jesus has me right now, and everything teaches. And this moment in my life, this series of months where I'm inconvenienced, what does he want to do in me? How does he want me to rely on him more? How does he want me to be a witness for him in the world? How does he want me to push against the grain where so many people are seeing the problems? And how can I be a person who voices solution? And how can I be a person who, again, exudes these traits that Jesus exudes versus how can I, fallen victim to the things where it's just I'm not getting things the way I want them to be. Like, all of that is sort of in this mix for me right now. And I think I've been thinking about it a lot in relationship even to the accusation of consumer Christianity. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this. In pastor circles, we hear it a little bit more because there's sort of, not that there's truly two different camps in evangelicalism, but this is maybe a simple way to put it. Picture two different types of churches. One church, the pastor is very hip and cool. The worship team has a laser light show and a smoke machine behind them, and everybody looks young and just they're kicking it. The children's ministry, colorful, decorative. There's like slurping machines back there and a little waiting place for kids. There's like Xboxes and jumpy castles, and everything is just nailed perfectly. The building is awesome. It's inviting. It's welcoming. It's really, really cool. And all of that is there. And then you got another church, and their focus is like, man, it's less on the frills and the gimmicks, but we teach the Bible. Every song we sing, we vetted it against theology and doctrine. We have a liturgy involved in what we do. And so there's this sense of we teach, we honor, we revere the holiness of the Lord and that kind of thing, where maybe the other church is like, we try to do outreach and evangelism, and we try to make Christianity real bite-sized so people can go live it in their everyday lives with their marriage and their parenting and their communication and their money and all of that. So you get these two different ideas. Well, the church that is more the holiness, liturgy, theology, teaching church looks at the other one and says, that's consumer Christianity. And it appeals to the consumer interest of people. And from that is a weaker form. That's an inferior form of Christianity, right? But we're the more committed, serious ones. But over the course of my time as a pastor, I've realized that real serious, committed, Bible teaching one, the people that go there because that's the kind of Christianity they desire to consume. And in that, they're sort of consumers of that. And when it's not exactly just right, there is a Goldilocks problem that is true to that group just as much as the group that says we want a really hip, cool, killer church where real simple messages are taught and it's real bite-sized, practical for your everyday life, and my kids love all the bells and whistles here, and I love the bells and whistles in the other women. Like all of it has this risk of consumerism. No matter where you land, if as soon as that's challenged, as soon as you can't have it that way, you go, I'm frustrated. It doesn't do it for me. I'm not staying plugged in. If I don't get it the way I like it, then suddenly I'm going to either kind of boycott it, walk away from it, lament it, whatever else. Like, all of that is the Goldilocks thing. It's like, if I don't get it my way just right, I'm not going to play, or I'm not going to engage, or I'm going to be a critic, or whatever else of the situation. And this is where we want to protect ourselves and make sure we get back to the message of Jesus where he said, you know what, I've called you to suffer, and sometimes suffering isn't major. Sometimes it's just being inconvenienced. And in the inconvenience where you don't get it the way you like it or the way you want it, you still stay engaged with it. You give your all to it. You make your deepest investment in that time, knowing that that's probably a real ripe season for some of your best growth, right? Because again, it's not about you and the way you dig it or the way you crave it, but rather it's just the way he's giving it to you. And I think that's part of what we have to kind of realize in some of this, that in these seasons of life, like right now, where none of us are getting to do church the way we want to. I mean, I can guarantee you as a pastor, I'm not getting to pastor the way I want to. I'm pastoring the way I have to. And yet in that, there's a lot of lessons that have been learned, right? And I think that's the thing that we want to realize, that we want to give ourselves to, that this is not a problematic time. No, this is a classroom setting, right? Because that's where the best teaching can happen if we're willing to receive it. But if we're only like, no, only when it's in the Goldilocks zone, only when it's not too hot, not too cold, just right, not too hard, not too soft, just right. That's where I'm going to grow and develop. I go, well, then that's going to be really, really challenging, because when it's really, really comfortable, you're not really learning what you need to learn. You're learning what you like to learn. I'm going to say that again. When it's really comfortable, you're probably not going to learn what you need to learn. You're going to learn what you like to learn. And that's what I see in both of those contexts that I was talking about earlier, right? In the Goldilocks zone, in the theology church, I get to learn rich, deep theology. I get to learn super intricate truths. I get to revere the depths of kind of philosophical thought in the biblical context. Like, woo, deep stuff, right? It's because I want to learn that, and I want to use words like, "Oh, that's rich," and that's so meaty, like that kind of stuff. Now, I know right now you're gonna think he's mocking that. I'm not mocking that. I think that's all great, but I think sometimes we go, "Oh, that's my comfort zone," and so I love to learn in my comfort zone thoughts that I find intriguing. It's so customized to what I dig, right? But when you have to pry that all away, now you're left with what you have to do and what you probably should learn. And sometimes the best things that we can learn are the stuff that comes out of when life is the most erratic and the most uncomfortable. And now I'm thrust into things that I don't want to have to deal with. And Jesus is like, right, that's where I want you, in places that you don't like. But here's the thing in that. When you're in a place where you don't like it, now you have like a fork in the road that you have to decide on, which is you're either going to say, all right, Jesus, what do you want to do here? Or you're going to block that out, and you're just going to, again, either protest or be frustrated and be sick and tired of the fact that it's like this, and you're just trying to get to the other side where it stops being like this and you can get back to Goldilocks land. That is a big waste of time and opportunity, because during this time, there's tons that we can learn. And so we want to resist the consumer-driven Christianity just as much on the other side, where it's like, no, I need church my way and my kids' ministry my way and my music my way and everything else, and I want it to be all cool and flashy and hip and rad and all that stuff. And if it's not that stuff, like, oh, it's not the same for me and I can't engage it. Again, then we need to dig a little deeper and be like, wait, no, this is really about me and Jesus and how he's trying to shape me more into him. And his whole life was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Like, his whole life was inconvenience, right? And yet it says in Hebrews that he learned obedience through his suffering, which I don't even fully know what that means. I just know that it's really important if he learned obedience through his suffering. In other words, we learn obedience through our inconvenience, through not getting it our way, through not always enjoying our circumstance. And much of that has to do with how we do our spiritual lives when it comes to our disciplines of small groups and church and worship and biblical study and all those kinds of things. Like, again, we want to resist it having to be our way, because what we want is to do things his way, especially when things aren't our way, Because I have heard about this with Christians where they're like, you know what, if I have to distance, I'm not going to do it. If I have to wear a mask, I'm not going to do it. If we don't get church exactly the way it used to be our way, we're not going to do it. In fact, even there's a rather large church in California that they could have met outside, but they didn't want to meet outside. They wanted to meet inside, and not just want to meet inside, but they wanted to meet inside, and they didn't want to have to distance, and they didn't want to have to wear masks. And so it's going through the court system, and they're treating it as though they're being persecuted and their First Amendment rights are being violated, where in the end they could meet. It might be a little inconvenient for them to meet the way that they were being asked to meet, but unless it's their way, they're going to see it as persecution and they're going to fight it. And I go, this is an example of, unless it's exactly the way I consume it, I'm going to see it as somehow then being persecutory or problematic. And again, I just go back to, if we're not willing to be inconvenienced for the sake of Jesus, imagine the day where we actually have to suffer. Are we going to be ready for that? Because if we're proving we can't even be inconvenienced and keep a good spirit and a joyful heart and a sense of objectivity and a sense of drive to, again, be content, then what's it going to be like when things are really, really bad, really, really hurting, real, honest persecution? See, that's the thing I look at. And I know some people are going to disagree with me on some of this stuff and be like, no, you don't understand. It's the First Amendment and we should be allowed to do it exactly the way we want to and government shouldn't intrude on that. And hey, I get all of that. And again, I think there's certainly discussions to be had and arguments to be made about that. My issue is more about the tone that we are conveying and the fact that we are thinking if it isn't exactly my way in the Goldilocks zone and I'm inconvenienced, well, that is part and parcel to suffering, and that's part and parcel to persecution when we are light years away from that kind of thing in our society, but we start to sound like that. Like there's almost this victimization of Christianity right now, like we're being oppressed. I'm like, well, so are the strippers, you know what I mean? Like, so are like all the dance clubs. I mean, like, it's not really persecution. It's just this weird medical crisis, and we should be the ones that are, again, most exhibiting the calm and the peace and the chill, and we're willing to be inconvenienced and receive that with joy because we know that teaches. For other people that don't know Jesus, this is just a bummer. It's a financial bummer, it's a social bummer, it's a practical bummer. It's just a bummer, right? But for the Christian, we go, man, this is a classroom. It's a classroom where I get to grow and I get to develop and I get to learn, where I submit more of myself to Him. Instead of getting lost in my own frustrations and thoughts and just wanting to get to the other side of a problem. Like, no, it's all the journey of what He wants to teach me in the journey. And I believe if we can commit ourselves to that, to not looking in terms of being like Goldilocks, not being consumers, but rather we would be participants and servants of His mission in the world. I think the world could look at that and they could see us and they could experience this is how the gospel can really change a life. And again, it's not about how customized things can be to my satisfaction, but more how I can give myself to His purposes for His satisfaction. Like the more we do that, the more it shows that this whole message of Jesus is otherworldly. And then from that, people can see that we are His everyday missionaries.